That's just cheap street art. The cruel words echoed across the Las Vegas sidewalk as wealthy tourist Mrs. Wellington dismissed the beautiful portrait that 43-year-old Antonio Ramirez had just completed of her grandson. Antonio's hands trembled as he held the painting he had spent 2 hours perfecting, watching the woman tear a $20 bill in half and throw it at his feet. For 20 years, Antonio had been painting portraits on the streets of Las Vegas, each masterpiece a testament to talent that galleries refused to recognize. Because of his Mexican heritage and humble circumstances. What Mrs. Wellington didn't know was that the street artist she was humiliating held a master's degree in fine arts from Yale University, had once taught at prestigious art academies, and created works that belonged in museums, not on sidewalks. Elvis Presley, who had been walking past on his way to a late lunch, stopped when he heard the commotion and witnessed something that would change not just Antonio's life, but his own understanding of what it means to be a true patron of the arts. But to understand why this moment would prove that real talent transcends social prejudice and that recognition often comes from the most unexpected places, you need to know about the choice Antonio made 15 years earlier that cost him everything, but led him to this life-changing encounter. It was November 3, 1975, outside Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk where Antonio Ramirez had set up his modest easel and folding chair. His art supplies were carefully arranged in an old wooden box that had seen better days, but his brushes were clean, his paints fresh, and his technique flawless. Antonio had been in this same spot for 3 years now, ever since he'd arrived in Las Vegas with nothing but his artistic skills and a broken heart. The tourists who stopped for portraits saw only what they expected to see, a Mexican man in worn clothes trying to make a living on the street. They had no idea they were commissioning work from someone who had once exhibited in the Louvre, whose paintings had sold for thousands of dollars in New York galleries, whose students had gone on to become celebrated artists themselves. The fall from grace had been swift and devastating. In 1960, Antonio had been Antonio Ramirez Villalobos, a rising star in the New York art world. His paintings combined classical European techniques with vibrant Mexican cultural themes, creating works that critics called revolutionary and deeply moving. He had been featured in Art Forum magazine, collected by wealthy patrons, and courted by the most prestigious galleries in Manhattan. But success in the art world, Antonio had learned, was as much about politics as it was about talent. When he refused to change his painting style to match current trends, when he declined to abandon his cultural themes for more universally marketable subjects, when he wouldn't compromise his artistic integrity for commercial success, the art establishment turned against him. The final blow came when he was falsely accused of forging paintings by a jealous rival who had connections throughout the gallery system. Though the charges were eventually dropped, the scandal destroyed his reputation. Collectors stopped buying his work, galleries refused to represent him, and art schools declined to hire him. Within 2 years, Antonio Ramirez Villalobos had become just Antonio Ramirez, painting portraits on street corners to survive. He had chosen Las Vegas because it was a place where people came to reinvent themselves, where the past could be left behind. But even here, 15 years later, the prejudice followed him. Gallery owners took one look at his Mexican features and modest appearance and dismissed his work without even seeing it. "We don't really do that style," they would say, or "it's not quite what our clientele is looking for." So Antonio painted on sidewalks, creating masterpieces for tourists who paid $20 and considered themselves generous. Each portrait was a work of art that could hang in any museum, but most ended up in hotel rooms or luggage, temporary decorations for people who had no idea of their true value. Mrs. Wellington was typical of the customers Antonio encountered daily. She was in her 60s, dripping with expensive jewelry, carrying a designer handbag that cost more than Antonio made in 3 months. Her 8-year-old grandson, Timothy, was visiting Las Vegas with his grandmother as part of a luxury vacation that included suites at Caesar's Palace, dinners at 5-star restaurants, and shopping expeditions that could fund a small business. When Timothy had spotted Antonio's easel and begged his grandmother for a portrait, Mrs. Wellington had initially refused. "Those street artists are just scam artists, darling," she had told the boy. "Their work is cheap and worthless." But Timothy had been persistent, and eventually Mrs. Wellington agreed, making it clear that she was only indulging her grandson's whim. Antonio had approached the commission with the same care and attention he brought to every piece. He studied Timothy's face carefully, noting the intelligent eyes, the slight tilt of his head when he was thinking, the way afternoon light caught the copper highlights in his brown hair. The resulting portrait was extraordinary, a work that captured not just Timothy's physical appearance, but something essential about his personality and spirit. For 2 hours, Antonio worked with the precision and skill that had once made him famous. He used techniques he had learned in the finest art schools, applied principles of composition and color theory that most people had never heard of, created depth and emotion that few artists could achieve. The portrait that emerged was museum-quality work, a piece that revealed Timothy's intelligence, curiosity, and gentle nature. But when Antonio finally turned the easel to show Mrs. Wellington the completed portrait, her reaction was not admiration or appreciation. It was disgust and dismissal. "That's just cheap street art," she declared loudly enough for other passers-by to hear. "I wouldn't hang this in my maid's quarters." She grabbed her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, but instead of paying Antonio, she tore it in half and threw both pieces at his feet. "There's your payment for your worthless scribbles." The humiliation was devastating, but it was also familiar. Antonio had endured similar treatment hundreds of times over the years. He bent to pick up the torn money, his face burning with shame as tourists stared and whispered. Timothy looked confused and hurt, clearly recognizing the beauty of the portrait, even if his grandmother couldn't see it. What none of them noticed was the man who had stopped to watch this scene unfold from a few feet away. Elvis Presley had been walking from his hotel to a nearby restaurant when he heard Mrs. Wellington's cruel words. Initially, he had paused simply because he was curious about the artwork. But as he looked at the portrait Antonio had created, Elvis realized he was seeing something exceptional. Elvis had always had an eye for talent. He could recognize authentic artistic expression, whether it came from a musician, a songwriter, or in this case, a visual artist. The portrait of Timothy was extraordinary, not just technically proficient, but emotionally resonant in a way that revealed genuine artistic genius. As Mrs. Wellington continued her public humiliation of Antonio, Elvis felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. It was the same feeling he had experienced as a young musician when establishment figures had dismissed his music as trash or not real art. He understood what it felt like to have your work degraded by people who couldn't recognize talent when it was right in front of them. But Elvis also noticed something that Mrs. Wellington had missed in her rush to judgment. The brushwork in Antonio's portrait was sophisticated, the use of color and light masterful, the composition classical but with innovative touches that suggested formal training at the highest level. This was not the work of an amateur street artist trying to make a quick buck. This was the work of someone with serious artistic education and decades of experience. "Excuse me," Elvis said, stepping forward and removing his sunglasses. Mrs. Wellington turned, ready to dismiss this interruption, but stopped short when she recognized who was speaking. "Mr. Presley," she exclaimed, her tone immediately shifting from dismissive to deferential. "I had no idea you we're such huge fans of your work." Elvis nodded politely, but kept his attention focused on Antonio, who was still gathering the torn pieces of money from the sidewalk. "Sir," Elvis said, addressing the artist directly, "may I take a look at your work?" Antonio looked up, surprised to find Elvis Presley asking permission to examine his portrait. "Of course," he said quietly, gesturing toward the easel. Elvis studied the painting carefully, taking in every brushstroke, every subtle gradation of color, every carefully considered detail. The longer he looked, the more impressed he became. This wasn't just a good street portrait, this was museum-quality art created under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. "This is extraordinary work," Elvis said finally, his voice carrying clearly to the growing crowd of onlookers. "The technique is masterful, The composition is sophisticated, and the emotional depth is remarkable. You have real talent." Mrs. Wellington looked flustered. "Mr. Presley, surely you're not suggesting that this street art is actually—" "I'm suggesting," Elvis interrupted, his voice taking on the authority that had commanded stages around the world, "that what we have here is the work of a serious artist who deserves respect, not ridicule." He turned to Antonio, who was staring at Elvis in amazement. "How long have you been painting professionally?" 25 years, Antonio replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And where did you study?" Antonio hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "I attended art school in New York." Elvis could sense there was more to the story, but he didn't press. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. "I'd like to commission a piece from you," he said. "Something original, not a portrait. Would you be interested?" The crowd that had gathered around them gasped audibly. Mrs. Wellington looked like she had been slapped. Timothy tugged on his grandmother's sleeve, clearly pleased that someone appreciated the beautiful portrait she had just rejected. Antonio couldn't believe what he was hearing. You want to commission a painting from me?" "I do," Elvis confirmed, "but not here on the sidewalk. You deserve a proper studio space to work in. Do you have somewhere we could discuss this privately?" Antonio's mind was racing. For 15 years, he had dreamed of someone recognizing his talent, of getting a real commission from someone who appreciated art, and now Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was offering him exactly that. "I have a small apartment nearby," Antonio said carefully. "I do my serious work there." "Your serious work?" Elvis asked, intrigued. Antonio glanced around at the crowd of tourists and lowered his voice. "I paint more than just portraits. I have been working on larger pieces, personal projects." Elvis nodded understandingly. "I'd very much like to see them, if you'd be willing to share them." Mrs. Wellington, who had been watching this exchange with growing discomfort, finally found her voice. "Mr. Presley, I think there's been some misunderstanding here. This is just a street artist who—" "Ma'am," Elvis said, turning to face her with a look that was polite but unmistakably firm. "I think the misunderstanding is yours. You just dismissed a work of art that belongs in a gallery. You humiliated a talented artist because you couldn't see past your own prejudices to recognize genuine skill." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Mrs. Wellington's face turned red with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to." "I'm sure you didn't mean to," Elvis continued. "But that's exactly the problem. You looked at this man and saw what you expected to see instead of what was actually there. You saw his ethnicity, his modest circumstances, his street corner location, and you decided his work was worthless without even really looking at it." He gestured toward the portrait of Timothy, which was still displayed on the easel. "Look at this painting again. Really look at it. Look at the technical skill, the artistic vision, the emotional depth. This is the work of someone who has dedicated his life to mastering his craft." Mrs. Wellington reluctantly looked at the portrait again, and for the first time, she actually saw it. The sophisticated brushwork, the masterful use of light and shadow, the way Antonio had captured not just Timothy's physical appearance, but something essential about his character. It was, she had to admit, extraordinary work. "I suppose it is rather good," she said grudgingly. "It's not rather good," Elvis corrected. "It's exceptional, and your grandson is lucky to have been painted by such a talented artist." Timothy, who had been watching this entire exchange with wide eyes, tugged on his grandmother's dress. "Grandma, can we buy my picture? It's beautiful. And the nice man worked so hard on it." Mrs. Wellington looked at her grandson, then at Elvis, then at Antonio, who was still holding the pieces of the torn $20 bill. For a moment, her face showed genuine remorse. "Of course we can buy it," she said quietly. She opened her purse and pulled out several $100 bills. "I'm afraid I owe you an apology, sir, and proper payment for your work." Antonio stared at the money in shock. It was more than he usually made in a week. "Thank you," he managed to say. "Thank you very much." But Elvis wasn't finished. Mrs. Wellington, I have a favor to ask of you. Anything, Mr. Presley. I want you to tell everyone you know about this experience. I want you to tell them about the talented artist you met on the Las Vegas Strip, about the beautiful portrait he created, about how wrong first impressions can be. Can you do that for me?" Mrs. Wellington nodded vigorously. "Yes, of course, I'll tell everyone." "Good," Elvis said, "because artists like Antonio deserve recognition for their talent, not discrimination because of their circumstances." As the crowd began to disperse and Mrs. Wellington led Timothy away with his portrait carefully wrapped, Elvis turned back to Antonio. "Now about that studio visit. Are you free this evening?" Antonio's apartment was a modest one-bedroom unit in a building that had seen better days. But when he opened the door to let Elvis inside, it was immediately clear that this was the home of a serious artist. The living room had been converted into a studio space, with professional-grade easels, a vast array of art supplies, and paintings at various stages of completion covering every available surface. Elvis stood in the doorway, taking in the scope of Antonio's work. The paintings were extraordinary, large canvases that combined classical techniques with bold, innovative approaches to color and composition. There were landscapes that seemed to pulse with life, portraits that captured the essence of their subjects with startling clarity, and abstract works that conveyed profound emotion through pure form and color. "My God," Elvis breathed. "These are incredible. How long have you been working on these?" "Some of them for years," Antonio replied, moving around the small space to show Elvis different pieces. "This one I started 5 years ago. This series here, I've been developing for the past decade." Elvis studied each painting carefully, his amazement growing with every piece he examined. "Antonio, these belong in galleries. These belong in museums. Why aren't you showing these anywhere?" Antonio's expression darkened. "I've tried. For 15 years I've tried. Every gallery in Las Vegas has seen my portfolio. Most of them won't even look at my work once they see who I am." "What do you mean?" Antonio hesitated, then pulled out a worn portfolio from beneath one of his easels. Inside were rejection letters from dozens of galleries, art dealers, and exhibition spaces. The reasons given were always vague. "Not quite right for our current exhibition schedule, or doesn't fit our aesthetic vision, or not commercially viable at this time." "But look at this," Antonio said, pulling out a letter from a prestigious New York gallery. The letterhead was impressive, the tone professional, but the message was devastating. "While Mr. Ramirez demonstrates technical proficiency, his work lacks the sophistication and cultural relevance that our clientele expects." Elvis read the letter, his jaw tightening with anger. "This is ridiculous. Your work is more sophisticated than anything I've seen in most galleries. What they're really saying is that they don't want to represent a Mexican artist." "That's exactly what they're saying," Antonio confirmed. "They'll never say it directly, because that would be illegal. But the message is always the same. My work isn't acceptable because I'm not acceptable." Elvis set the rejection letter down and looked around the studio again. The quality of the work was undeniable. The technique was flawless, the artistic vision unique and compelling, the emotional impact profound. These paintings deserved to be seen by the world, not hidden away in a small apartment because of gallery owners' prejudices. "Antonio," Elvis said finally, "I want to help you change this situation. Mr. Presley, that's very kind of you, but I don't think you understand how entrenched these attitudes are. I've been fighting this battle for 15 years. Maybe you've been fighting it alone," Elvis replied. "But you don't have to anymore." Over the next 2 hours, Elvis and Antonio discussed art, creativity, and the challenges facing artists who didn't fit the establishment's narrow definitions of acceptability. Elvis shared his own experiences with industry gatekeepers who had tried to control his music, change his style, and dictate his career choices. "The thing is," Elvis said, "I had advantages you don't have. I had Colonel Parker managing my career. I had record labels investing in my success. I had a whole system that eventually worked in my favor. But you've been doing this alone, without support, without connections, without anyone willing to take a chance on your talent. That's the way it's always been for artists like me, Antonio said sadly. We create our art, but we have to accept that recognition may never come. That's not acceptable, Elvis said firmly. Talent like yours should be celebrated, not hidden. And I'm going to make sure that happens. The next morning, Elvis began making phone calls. He contacted gallery owners, art dealers, and collectors throughout Las Vegas and beyond. Using his influence and reputation, he arranged for Antonio to have private viewings with people who had the power to change his career trajectory. The response was immediate and dramatic. When gallery owners learned that Elvis Presley was personally recommending an artist, they were suddenly very interested in seeing that artist's work. Doors that had been closed to Antonio for 15 years opened overnight. The first major breakthrough came when Marcus Goldstein, owner of the most prestigious gallery in Las Vegas, agreed to visit Antonio's studio. Goldstein had been skeptical. After all, Elvis was a musician, not an art expert. But when he saw Antonio's paintings, his skepticism evaporated. "This is museum-quality work," Goldstein said after examining several canvases. "The technique is extraordinary, the vision is unique, and the emotional impact is profound. Why haven't I seen your work before?" Antonio showed him the stack of rejection letters, and Goldstein's expression grew grim. "This is shameful," he said. "These people have let their prejudices blind them to obvious talent." Within a week, Goldstein had organized a solo exhibition of Antonio's work at his gallery. The opening night was attended by Las Vegas's cultural elite, many of them curious to see what had impressed Elvis Presley so much that he had personally championed an unknown street artist. The reaction was electric. Critics who had never heard of Antonio Ramirez were suddenly writing reviews that compared his work to the masters. Collectors were competing to purchase his paintings. Art schools were offering him teaching positions. The same establishment that had rejected him for 15 years was now hailing him as a major discovery. Elvis attended the opening night, but he stayed in the background, letting Antonio have his moment in the spotlight. When reporters asked him about his role in discovering this new talent, Elvis deflected the praise. "I didn't discover Antonio," he said. "His talent was always there for anyone to see. I just happened to be looking." But Antonio knew better. When the crowd had thinned, and the critics had gone home to write their reviews, he found Elvis standing in front of one of his largest paintings, a vibrant landscape that captured the desert beauty surrounding Las Vegas. "Mr. Presley," Antonio said quietly. "I don't know how to thank you." Elvis turned and smiled. "You don't need to thank me. You did the hard part. You created something beautiful despite all the obstacles. I just made sure people had a chance to see it." "But why?" Antonio asked. "Why did you care enough to help me?" Elvis was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Because I know what it's like to have people dismiss your work before they really experience it. I know what it's like to be judged by your background, instead of your talent. And I know that when someone has a gift like yours, the world deserves to see it." The success of Antonio's gallery exhibition led to opportunities that had seemed impossible just months before. Museums began acquiring his work for their permanent collections. Art magazines featured his story as an example of how talent can triumph over discrimination. Universities invited him to lecture on technique and artistic vision. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 6 months after the gallery opening, when Antonio received an unexpected visitor at his new studio, a spacious, well-lit space that replaced the cramped apartment where he had worked in obscurity for so many years. Mrs. Wellington stood in the doorway, looking embarrassed but determined. "Mr. Ramirez," she said. "I wondered if I might speak with you." Antonio invited her in. Curious about what she might want, she looked around the professional studio space, taking in the large canvases, the sophisticated equipment, the evidence of a successful artistic career. "I came to apologize," she said finally, "and to make a confession. After I met you that day on the sidewalk, after Mr. Presley made me really look at Timothy's portrait, I took it home and hung it in my living room. Everyone who sees it comments on how beautiful it is. They ask who painted it, and I tell them about the talented artist I met in Las Vegas." She paused, looking directly at Antonio. "I also tell them about how wrong I was to judge you based on where you were working instead of what you were creating. I tell them that I learned an important lesson about prejudice and talent from a man I initially dismissed as worthless." Antonio nodded, appreciating her honesty. "Thank you for telling me that. It means more than you might realize." "There's something else," Mrs. Wellington continued. "I'd like to commission another painting from you, something for my grandson Timothy. He's asked for it specifically. He says he wants a painting by the famous artist who did his portrait." Antonio smiled. "I'd be honored to paint for Timothy again." As Mrs. Wellington left, Antonio reflected on the journey that had brought him from street corner humiliation to gallery recognition. It had taken 15 years of persistence, countless rejections, and the intervention of an unlikely advocate to achieve what talent alone couldn't accomplish. But the most important lesson wasn't about the art world's prejudices, or the power of celebrity endorsement. It was about the importance of seeing people as they truly are, rather than as we expect them to be. Elvis had looked at a street artist and seen a master. Mrs. Wellington had looked at the same person and seen someone worthless, until she learned to look again. The exhibition catalog for Antonio's first major museum show, held at the Nevada Museum of Art 2 years after his discovery, included an essay about his journey from street artist to celebrated painter. The essay concluded with a quote from Elvis Presley: "True talent doesn't need perfect circumstances to flourish, but it does need someone willing to recognize it." Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply pay attention to what's right in front of us. Antonio kept a copy of that catalog in his studio, not as a monument to his success, but as a reminder of the day when someone finally saw his work for what it truly was. The torn $20 bill from that afternoon, carefully taped back together, was framed on his wall, not as a symbol of humiliation, but as evidence of how dramatically circumstances can change when talent meets opportunity. Today, Antonio Ramirez is recognized as one of the most important contemporary artists working in the American Southwest. His paintings hang in major museums, his technique is studied in art schools, and his story is cited as an example of how perseverance and authentic talent can overcome systemic discrimination. But he still remembers every detail of that November afternoon, when Elvis Presley stopped to really look at a street artist's work, and saw something that everyone else had missed. It was a reminder that recognition often comes not from those we expect to understand us, but from those who take the time to see beyond surface appearances to the truth underneath. The portrait of Timothy Wellington, now grown and working as a teacher, still hangs in his grandmother's living room. It serves as a constant reminder of the lesson she learned about the danger of judging artists by anything other than their art. And whenever visitors comment on its beauty, and ask about the artist who created it, she tells them the story of the day she almost missed encountering genius because she couldn't see past her own prejudices. In the end, Antonio's story became about more than one artist's struggle for recognition. It became a powerful reminder that talent exists in unexpected places, that creativity flourishes, despite obstacles, and that sometimes the most important role we can play is simply being willing to truly see what others have chosen to ignore. Elvis Presley's intervention didn't create Antonio's talent, that had always been there, but it ensured that the world would finally have the chance to appreciate what had been hiding in plain sight all along. The transformation of Antonio's life had ripple effects that extended far beyond his personal success. The story of his discovery became a catalyst for broader changes in how the art world approached diversity and inclusion. Gallery owners who had previously dismissed artists based on ethnicity or economic status began reconsidering their selection criteria and exhibition policies. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a professor of art history at the University of Nevada, conducted a comprehensive study of Antonio's case and its impact on the contemporary art scene. Her research revealed that Antonio's success had opened doors for dozens of other previously overlooked artists, particularly those from minority backgrounds, who had been systematically excluded from mainstream galleries. The Antonio Ramirez phenomenon, as Dr. Martinez termed it, demonstrated how a single act of recognition by an influential figure could reshape an entire industry's practices. Gallery owners, suddenly aware that they might be overlooking the next Antonio, began actively seeking out artists from diverse backgrounds and unconventional venues. The Las Vegas Street Artists Association was formed 6 months after Antonio's gallery debut, providing support, resources, and advocacy for artists working in public spaces. The organization offered legal assistance for artists facing harassment, marketing support for those seeking gallery representation, and educational workshops on business skills and artistic development. Elvis's role in founding this organization was kept deliberately quiet, but those involved knew that his financial backing and behind-the-scenes advocacy were crucial to its success. He attended the organization's monthly meetings when his schedule allowed, always sitting in the back and contributing more through listening than speaking. Elvis understood that what happened with Antonio was just the beginning, said Maria Santos, the organization's first president and herself a former street artist who had gained gallery representation following Antonio's success. He saw that there were dozens, maybe hundreds of talented artists working on sidewalks and in parks who deserved the same chance Antonio got. The impact extended to art education as well. The University of Nevada established the Antonio Ramirez Scholarship for students from underrepresented communities pursuing degrees in fine arts. The scholarship included not just tuition assistance, but mentorship from established artists, internship opportunities with galleries and museums, and guaranteed exhibition space for graduating recipients. Antonio became actively involved in the scholarship program, serving on the selection committee and providing personal mentorship to recipients. He often spoke about how different his own educational journey might have been if such support had existed when he was starting out. "I was fortunate enough to attend Yale," he told one group of scholarship recipients, "but I graduated into a system that wasn't designed to support artists who looked like me or came from backgrounds like mine. Your generation has the opportunity to change that system from the inside." The scholarship program's success led to similar initiatives at universities across the country. Art schools that had historically been dominated by students from privileged backgrounds began actively recruiting diverse candidates and providing the support necessary for them to succeed. Elvis's commitment to supporting emerging artists extended beyond his advocacy for Antonio. He quietly funded a network of small galleries and alternative exhibition spaces throughout the Southwest, creating venues specifically designed to showcase work by artists who might not find representation in traditional commercial galleries. These spaces, known collectively as the Desert Canvas Network, operated on a different model from conventional galleries. Instead of taking large commissions from sales, they charged modest rental fees for exhibition space and provided artists with the majority of proceeds from their sales. The galleries also offered workshops on pricing, marketing, and business development, skills that many artists lacked despite their creative talents. The success of the Desert Canvas Network attracted attention from arts organizations nationwide. The model was replicated in cities across the country, creating a parallel gallery system that prioritized artistic merit and community engagement over commercial considerations and social connections. Antonio's original street corner, outside Caesar's Palace, became an unofficial landmark in Las Vegas. The sidewalk where he had endured years of humiliation was marked with a small bronze plaque reading, "In recognition of the artists whose talents enrich our community." Tourists often stopped to take pictures, especially after learning the story of what had happened there. The location also became a gathering place for street artists, many of whom saw Antonio's success as proof that recognition was possible even in the face of systemic discrimination. An informal mentorship network developed, with established artists providing guidance and support to newcomers trying to make a living through their art. Elvis occasionally walked past the spot during his visits to Las Vegas, always pausing to observe whoever might be working there on any given day. He never identified himself or interfered with their work, but local artists learned to recognize him and appreciated his quiet presence as a sign of respect for their efforts. The art world's response to Antonio's story was not universally positive. Some critics argued that celebrity endorsement was an unreliable method for identifying artistic merit, and that Elvis's intervention had created false expectations for other street artists. These critics worried that the focus on Antonio's dramatic discovery detracted from more systematic efforts to address discrimination in arts institutions. Dr. Robert Chen, a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, wrote an influential essay arguing that the romanticization of the struggling artist narrative obscures the real structural changes needed to create equitable opportunities in the art world. He cautioned against viewing Antonio's story as proof that the system worked, when in fact it demonstrated how randomly recognition was distributed. Antonio himself was thoughtful about these criticisms. In interviews, he acknowledged that his success was partly due to extraordinary circumstances that other artists might never encounter. He used his platform to advocate for institutional changes that would create more predictable pathways to recognition for talented artists from all backgrounds. "My story shouldn't be seen as evidence that the system is fair," he said in a speech at the National Arts Advocacy Conference. "It should be seen as evidence of how unfair the system usually is." The fact that it took 15 years and a chance encounter with Elvis Presley for my work to be recognized shows how many talented artists are probably still waiting for their moment. This advocacy work led to Antonio's appointment to the National Endowment for the Arts Advisory Panel, where he worked to ensure that federal arts funding reached diverse communities and unconventional venues. His experience as a street artist gave him unique insights into the challenges facing artists who worked outside traditional institutional frameworks. The documentary film Canvas and Concrete, the Antonio Ramirez story, premiered 3 years after his gallery debut, providing a comprehensive look at his journey from street artist to museum exhibitor. The film included interviews with gallery owners, art critics, fellow artists, and of course Antonio himself. Elvis declined to be interviewed for the documentary, preferring to let the focus remain on Antonio and the broader issues his story raised. However, he did provide a brief written statement that was read during the film's conclusion. "Antonio's talent speaks for itself. My role was simply to help ensure that people had the opportunity to listen." The film won several awards at art and documentary film festivals, and its broadcast on public television introduced Antonio's story to a national audience. The response was overwhelming, with viewers from across the country reaching out to share their own experiences of being overlooked or undervalued because of their backgrounds. Many of these viewers were artists themselves, working in various mediums and facing similar challenges in gaining recognition for their work. Antonio began corresponding with dozens of these artists, providing encouragement and practical advice based on his own experiences. This correspondence evolved into a formal mentorship program, with Antonio working with arts organizations to connect established artists with emerging talents who might benefit from guidance and support. The program emphasized not just artistic development, but also the business and networking skills necessary to build sustainable careers in the arts. The success of this mentorship network demonstrated the hunger that existed in the arts community for more inclusive and supportive systems. Traditional gatekeepers had created barriers that kept many talented artists from reaching their potential, but grassroots initiatives were beginning to create alternative pathways to success. Elvis continued to support these efforts through both financial contributions and personal involvement. He attended exhibition openings, purchased works by emerging artists, and used his connections to create opportunities for artists who might otherwise remain unknown. His approach was always subtle and respectful of the artist's autonomy. Rather than trying to shape their careers or influence their artistic choices, he simply worked to ensure that their talents had opportunities to be seen and appreciated by broader audiences. The relationship between Elvis and Antonio evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. They met regularly to discuss art, music, and the challenges facing creative individuals in commercial industries. These conversations often touched on the parallels between their experiences with establishment gatekeepers and the importance of maintaining artistic integrity despite external pressures. Antonio's influence on Elvis was as significant as Elvis's influence on Antonio. The musician began collecting art more seriously, developing a sophisticated understanding of visual aesthetics that informed his own creative choices. He also became more conscious of how his platform could be used to support other artists and creative causes. The friendship between the two men became a symbol of how different forms of artistic expression could support and inspire each other. Musicians and visual artists began collaborating more frequently, creating interdisciplinary works that drew on the strengths of multiple artistic traditions. This cross-pollination of ideas led to innovative exhibition formats, with galleries presenting shows that combined visual art, music, and performance. These multimedia exhibitions attracted new audiences to galleries and created fresh contexts for experiencing artistic work. Antonio's success also had personal dimensions that extended beyond his professional achievements. The financial security that came with gallery representation allowed him to reconnect with family members in Mexico whom he had lost touch with during his years of struggle. He began incorporating elements of his family history into his paintings, creating works that explored themes of immigration, cultural identity, and the meaning of home. These more personal works proved to be among his most powerful, resonating with viewers who shared similar experiences of displacement and cultural navigation. The paintings became part of a broader conversation about identity and belonging in American society, with Antonio's story serving as an example of how individuals could maintain cultural authenticity while achieving mainstream success. The critical reception of these works established Antonio not just as a talented technician, but as an important voice in contemporary discussions about culture and identity. Art historians began studying his work in the context of other Latino artists who had used their platforms to explore similar themes. This scholarly attention led to retrospective exhibitions at major museums, with Antonio's work being presented alongside that of other significant Latino artists from throughout American history. These exhibitions helped establish a broader narrative about the contributions of Latino artists to American culture and the ongoing challenges they faced in gaining recognition. The educational impact of Antonio's story extended into K-12 schools as well. Teachers used his experience as a case study in lessons about prejudice, perseverance, and the importance of recognizing talent regardless of its packaging. Students wrote essays about times when they or someone they knew had been underestimated because of superficial characteristics. These educational initiatives helped create a generation of young people who were more conscious of the ways that bias could prevent them from recognizing talent and potential in others. The hope was that this awareness would translate into more inclusive practices as these students entered their own professional careers. Antonio regularly visited schools to speak with students about his experiences, emphasizing the importance of persistence in the face of rejection and the value of believing in their own abilities even when others didn't recognize them. These visits were among the most rewarding aspects of his success, as they allowed him to directly influence young people's understanding of what was possible in their own lives. The legacy of that November afternoon outside Caesar's palace continued to evolve and expand, creating opportunities and changing perspectives in ways that neither Elvis nor Antonio could have anticipated. What began as a simple act of recognition, one person choosing to really see another person's talent, and it grown into a movement that challenged entire industries to reconsider their assumptions about who deserved opportunities and support. The story became a testament to the power of individual actions to create systemic change, and a reminder that every person we encounter might be carrying talents and dreams that deserve recognition and support. It proved that sometimes the most profound social transformations begin not with grand gestures or institutional reforms, but with one person choosing to look past surface appearances and see the potential that exists in every human being. 20 years after that transformative afternoon, Antonio Ramirez stood in the Smithsonian National Museum of American Art, looking at a retrospective exhibition of his life's work. The exhibition, titled From Street to Gallery, The Art of Antonio Ramirez, featured over 50 of his paintings spanning 3 decades of creative development. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the portrait of Timothy Wellington that had started it all. The painting that Mrs. Wellington had initially dismissed as cheap street art, the museum had acquired it as part of their permanent collection, recognizing it as a historically significant work that represented both Antonio's technical mastery and the social issues surrounding art recognition and cultural prejudice. Standing next to the portrait was a recreation of Antonio's original street setup: the folding chair, the weathered easel, the old wooden box of art supplies. A placard explained how this modest equipment had been the workspace where masterpieces were created under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Visitors to the exhibition often spent long minutes studying this recreation, trying to imagine how someone could create museum-quality art while sitting on a sidewalk, dealing with weather, distractions, and the constant pressure of needing to complete work quickly to earn money for basic necessities. The exhibition catalog included essays from prominent art historians, critics, and curators who analyzed Antonio's work within the broader context of American art history. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the Smithsonian's chief curator of Latino art, wrote about how Antonio's success had paved the way for greater recognition of Latino artists throughout the United States. Antonio Ramirez represents a generation of artists whose talents were systematically overlooked by mainstream institutions, Dr. Rodriguez explained. His story illuminates both the barriers that existed and the potential that was being wasted when those barriers prevented recognition of legitimate artistic achievement. The exhibition also featured a section dedicated to the broader social impact of Antonio's story. Interactive displays showed visitors how his success had led to policy changes at art schools, new funding priorities for arts organizations, and the establishment of support networks for underrepresented artists. One particularly moving display featured letters from artists around the world who had been inspired by Antonio's story to persevere in their own creative pursuits despite facing discrimination or lack of recognition. These letters demonstrated how one person's breakthrough could provide hope and motivation for countless others facing similar struggles. The opening reception for the Smithsonian exhibition was attended by hundreds of people, including many of the artists who had benefited from the programs and initiatives that had grown out of Antonio's story. The diversity of the crowd, representing different ethnic backgrounds, economic circumstances, and artistic traditions, was itself a testament to how much the art world had changed. Elvis Presley's family was represented at the reception by his daughter Lisa Marie, who spoke about her father's commitment to recognizing and supporting talent wherever it was found. She revealed that Elvis had established a trust fund specifically to support emerging artists, with particular emphasis on those from underrepresented communities. "My father believed that talent was equally distributed, but opportunity was not," Lisa Marie told the audience. His support of Antonio was part of a larger philosophy about using whatever influence you have to create chances for people who might otherwise be overlooked. The trust fund had quietly supported hundreds of artists over the years, providing grants, scholarships, and exhibition opportunities without requiring public recognition of Elvis's involvement. The artists who benefited often didn't know the source of their support, which was exactly how Elvis had wanted it. Antonio used his speech at the reception to reflect on the journey that had brought him from street corner to National Museum. He spoke about the importance of persistence, the value of authentic artistic expression, and the responsibility that came with success to help others who were still struggling for recognition. I was fortunate to encounter someone who was willing to look past assumptions and see what was actually there, Antonio said. But for every story like mine that has a happy ending, there are probably dozens of artists whose talents are never recognized because they don't have that fortunate encounter. He announced the establishment of the Antonio Ramirez Foundation, which would work to identify and support promising artists who were working outside traditional institutional frameworks. The foundation would provide not just financial support, but also mentorship, business training, and connections to galleries and collectors. The foundation's first initiative was a mobile art program that would travel to communities across the United States, providing free art supplies, instruction, and exhibition opportunities in areas that lacked access to traditional arts infrastructure. The program was designed to reach artists who might never otherwise have the chance to develop their skills or share their work with broader audiences. Local artists in each community would be hired as instructors and coordinators, ensuring that the program reflected and supported existing cultural traditions while also providing exposure to new techniques and opportunities. The goal was not to impose outside artistic values, but to amplify and celebrate the creative expressions that already existed in different communities. The success of this mobile program led to partnerships with school districts in underserved areas, bringing professional art instruction and supplies to students who might otherwise never have access to such resources. These programs emphasized both technical skill development and creative expression, helping young people see art as both a form of personal expression and a potential career path. Follow-up studies of students who participated in these programs showed significantly higher rates of college attendance and creative career pursuit compared to control groups. The programs demonstrated that exposure to professional quality art education could have profound impacts on young people's sense of possibility and self-worth. The ripple effects of Antonio's story continued to spread in unexpected directions. Business schools began using his case as an example of how unconscious bias could prevent organizations from recognizing valuable talent and resources. The story became part of diversity training programs across various industries, not just in the arts. Corporate executives learned to question their assumptions about where talent might be found and how it might be packaged. The principle of looking beyond surface appearances to identify genuine ability became applied to hiring practices, promotion decisions, and business partnerships. Professional development programs began incorporating exercises based on Antonio's experience, challenging participants to identify their own biases and consider how those biases might cause them to overlook qualified individuals. These programs emphasize the business case for inclusive practices, showing how organizations benefited when they recognized and utilized talent from all sources. The academic study of Antonio's story became a specialty within sociology and organizational psychology departments. Researchers examined how single interventions could create cascading changes throughout complex systems, and how individual acts of recognition could trigger broader cultural shifts. Dr. Michael Thompson, a sociologist at Harvard University, conducted a longitudinal study of the changes in the art world that could be traced back to Antonio's discovery. His research documented measurable increases in gallery representation for Latino artists, growth in arts funding for community-based programs, and changes in art school admission and scholarship policies. The Antonio Ramirez effect, as Dr. Thompson termed it, became a model for understanding how social change could be catalyzed by strategic interventions at critical moments. The research had applications beyond the arts, influencing approaches to addressing inequality in various professional fields. The story's impact on popular culture was equally significant. Books, articles, documentaries, and even fictional adaptations explored the themes of hidden talent, social prejudice, and the importance of authentic recognition. These cultural productions helped spread awareness of the issues Antonio's story raised while also inspiring audiences to examine their own assumptions and behaviors. Children's books based on Antonio's experience became popular in schools, teaching young readers about the importance of not judging people by their appearances and the value of recognizing talent in unexpected places. These books often sparked classroom discussions about fairness, opportunity, and the ways that bias could prevent people from seeing others clearly. The annual Antonio Ramirez Day, observed in Las Vegas and several other cities, became an occasion for celebrating artistic achievement and reflecting on the ongoing need to create inclusive opportunities for creative expression. The day featured street art exhibitions, gallery openings, and educational programs designed to connect people with local artists and arts organizations. These celebrations often included recreations of Antonio's original street setup, allowing visitors to experience something approximating the conditions under which he had created his masterpieces. Many people were surprised by how difficult it was to draw or paint effectively, while sitting on a sidewalk with constant distractions and interruptions. The experience gave participants greater appreciation for the skill and dedication required to create quality art under such challenging circumstances. It also highlighted the resilience and determination that characterized many working artists who pursued their creative calling despite economic and social obstacles. As Antonio entered his 70s, he continued to paint with the same passion and skill that had characterized his entire career. His latest works explored themes of legacy, memory, and the ways that individual actions could ripple through time to create unexpected consequences. These paintings often featured images of hands holding brushes, hands offering help, hands reaching across cultural and economic divides. The symbolism was clear. Human connection and recognition were literally and figuratively created through the actions people chose to take toward one another. The final painting in Antonio's Smithsonian exhibition was a self-portrait that showed him painting at his street corner easel, but with ghostly figures of all the artists who had been supported through programs inspired by his story. The painting suggested that individual success was meaningful only when it contributed to broader opportunities for others. A small plaque next to the painting included a quote from Antonio: "I painted on sidewalks for 20 years, but I was never really painting alone." Every artist who struggles for recognition is part of a larger story about human potential and the importance of being seen for who we truly are. Today, the corner outside Caesar's Palace where Antonio spent so many years creating art has been transformed into a small park dedicated to street artists and public art. The space features rotating exhibitions of work by local artists, benches for visitors to sit and observe, and information about the history of the location and its role in Antonio's story. Tourists from around the world visit the park, many of them artists themselves who come to pay homage to a place where persistence and talent eventually received the recognition they deserved. The park has become an unofficial pilgrimage site for creative individuals who are still waiting for their own moment of discovery and acknowledgement. The park's centerpiece is a bronze sculpture showing two figures, one seated at an easel, one standing and observing. The sculpture doesn't identify the figures as Antonio and Elvis, but regular visitors understand the reference. It serves as a permanent reminder of how one person's willingness to truly see another can change both their lives and the broader world around them. The inscription on the sculpture's base reads simply, "Art lives wherever passion meets recognition." It's a message that continues to inspire new generations of artists, advocates, and anyone who believes in the transformative power of seeing others clearly and supporting their dreams with concrete action.